The Temporal Linguistics Institute had existed for approximately 412 standard cycles, which translated to roughly 600 Earth years, give or take a few decades, depending on whose calendar you trusted. In that considerable span of time, the Institute's researchers had catalogued over 9,000 languages from civilizations both extinct and thriving, decoded algorithmic communication patterns from machine intelligences that predated most organic species, and successfully translated the mating calls of the Vexllarii into something that didn't cause immediate hemorrhaging in listeners with auditory organs. All impressive achievements, certainly. Awards had been given. Tenure had been granted. Self-congratulation had flowed as freely as the fermented nutrient solutions at faculty parties. And yet, for all their accumulated expertise, centuries of dedicated scholarship, and enough computational power to simulate entire linguistic evolution chains, they had collectively agreed on one immutable truth. The Qor'vathian language was biologically impossible to speak. Not difficult, not challenging. Not really quite hard, requires extensive training. Impossible, as in, defied the known laws of organic phonetics. As in, every simulation suggested that attempting to produce these sounds would result in immediate structural failure of whatever biological apparatus tried to make them. The Institute had published 17 peer-reviewed papers on the subject, each more confident than the last, building an academic fortress of certainty that would have made lesser scholarly communities envious. Which made it all the more awkward when a human showed up and casually did it anyway. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's establish some context, shall we? Nexus Prime wasn't the largest research station in the Andromeda Administrative Zone, but it was certainly the most pretentious. Designed by a committee of 7 different species, each of whom had strong opinions about architectural superiority. The station looked like someone had asked a child to draw the future, and then given that sketch to engineers with unlimited budgets and insufficient adult supervision. Sweeping curves intersected with geometric precision. Transparent observation sections offered views of the surrounding nebula that were objectively stunning and practically useless for actual research. The docking bays could accommodate vessels from 43 different technological paradigms, which mostly meant nobody could find their ship when it was time to leave. The main conference hall occupied the station's central hub, a massive amphitheater that could be reconfigured for different atmospheric requirements, gravitational preferences, and sensory modalities. Today it housed the Triennial Symposium on Extinct Linguistic Systems, which was exactly as thrilling as it sounded unless you were a xenolinguist, in which case it was the social event of the decade. 317 registered attendees from 62 species had gathered to present research, network shamelessly, and argue about methodology with the kind of passion most beings reserved for survival situations or mate selection. The morning session had been mercifully brief. Some presentations on minor dialects, a debate about whether machine languages counted as extinct if the machines were still running, but nobody understood them anymore, and a surprisingly heated argument about the proper way to transliterate sounds that existed in dimensional frequencies most species couldn't perceive. Standard conference fare. But the afternoon keynote was different. This was the big one. The presentation everyone had come to see, even if they wouldn't admit it at the networking mixer later. The Qor'vathian impossibility, final proofs, and philosophical implications. Professor Thex'ron took the stage, with the kind of confidence that came from being correct for over a century. He was Nextarii, which meant he possessed 7 manipulator limbs arranged radially around a central sensory cluster, giving him the appearance of a very determined starfish that had been granted sentience and immediately decided to pursue higher education. His exoskeleton gleamed with subtle iridescence, a feature his species considered dignified, and everyone else found mildly unsettling in bright light. When he spoke, 3 of his limbs gesticulated in synchronized emphasis while the other 4 managed the holographic display controls. Because why do one thing at a time when you could do several? Esteemed colleagues, he began, his voice modulated through the universal translator with the kind of refined pomposity that required decades of academic achievement to perfect. We gather today not to mourn the loss of Qor'vathian linguistic heritage, but to celebrate the triumph of rigorous scientific analysis over wishful thinking. The audience responded with various species-appropriate sounds of approval: clicking, humming, harmonic resonance, and in one case, what sounded like controlled flatulence, but was actually a perfectly respectful acknowledgement from a methane-breathing delegate in the environmental containment section. The holographic display materialized above the stage, showing what appeared to be a sound wave having a nervous breakdown. Jagged peaks and impossible valleys twisted through three-dimensional space in patterns that seemed designed to offend the laws of physics. Labels in 17 different linguistic notation systems surrounded the waveform, each one essentially saying this shouldn't exist in increasingly technical terms. The Qor'vathian, Thex'ron continued, warming to his subject like a professor who'd forgotten he was supposed to keep it under an hour, vanished approximately 10,000 standard cycles ago. Their civilization spanned 47 star systems. Their technology remains, even now, more advanced than our own in several key areas. We have found their structures on dead worlds and thriving colonies alike. We have excavated their artifacts, analyzed their materials, and reverse-engineered their applications. But their language? He paused for dramatic effect, which his species had learned from watching too many human theatrical performances. Their language defies reproduction. Dr. Milivos drifted forward to join him on the stage, which was the Velnarii equivalent of walking but looked more like purposeful floating. The Velnarii were energy-based entities contained within magnetic field matrices that they generated themselves, giving them the appearance of softly glowing clouds with delusions of grandeur. Milivos had chosen a pleasing amber hue for the presentation, which their species considered professional and others found vaguely ominous. "My research team," Milivos announced, their voice rendered as melodic harmonics that the translator smoothed into standard galactic, has spent 80 cycles analyzing the biomechanical requirements for Qor'vathian phonetics. We have constructed models based on every known vocal apparatus configuration in our xenobiological databases. The hologram shifted to show rotating anatomical diagrams: throats, syrinxes, resonance chambers, vibrating membranes, pneumatic sacs, crystalline oscillators, and several structures that defied easy categorization spun through the display. Each one was labeled with a species name, and a conclusion rendered in helpful red text. Insufficient range. Incompatible structure. Would cause permanent damage. Physically impossible. The tonal requirements alone. Milivos continued, highlighting a section of the waveform that looked particularly aggressive, require 7 distinct pitch levels executed in sequence over 0.028 seconds. The click consonants demand simultaneous articulation at 4 separate contact points within the oral or equivalent cavity. The subharmonic resonance requires chamber volumes that exceed the cranial capacity of most species. And the breath control? They pulsed a darker orange, which indicated scholarly distress. Continuous airflow for up to 47 seconds, while maintaining vocal oscillation at frequencies between 12 Hz and 9,000 Hz, sometimes simultaneously. A ripple of discomfort spread through the audience. Several species shifted in their seating apparatus. One delegate's translation device made a sound like grinding gears, which was either a malfunction or editorial commentary. Captain Raxthor stood from his position in the front row, which caused the 3 beings behind him to crane their necks or equivalent structures in annoyance. He was Qor'vathian, descended from apex predators on a high-gravity world, and evolution had been very clear about its intentions: make something that could chase down anything and look intimidating while doing it. 8 feet tall, covered in interlocking armored plates, with a face that was mostly teeth and tactical assessment, Raxthor had the distinction of making most species nervous despite being a respected military liaison and decorated strategist. Raxthor had the distinction of military liaison. "Let's dispense with the academic theater," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that the translator rendered with appropriate menace. "The Qor'vathian left behind technology we need. Medical advances that could save billions. Energy systems that would revolutionize infrastructure. Weapons that" he paused as several scholars made disapproving noises, that we definitely only want for historical study and absolutely not tactical application. Nobody believed him, but everyone appreciated the gesture toward plausible deniability. Every facility we've excavated has the same security system, Raxthor continued. Vocal authentication. We have the words. We have pronunciation guides embedded in their own instructional materials, because apparently the Qor'vath expected people to be able to learn this disaster of a language. We know what sounds we're supposed to make. We simply cannot make them. Which brings us to our conclusion, Thex'ron interjected, reclaiming the presentation with the territorial instinct of a tenured professor. After 4 centuries of research, involving thousands of scholars, testing hundreds of species, and utilizing computational models that border on artificial consciousness, we can definitively state, Qor'vathian was either spoken by beings with radically different biology than anything in our current databases, or it was a purely theoretical construct never intended for actual verbal use. Either way, it cannot be spoken by any contemporary species. He said this with the finality of someone closing a book on a mystery solved. The audience absorbed it with the satisfaction of a community consensus confirmed, which was the exact moment the rear entrance doors cycled open with a pneumatic hiss that nobody heard over the murmur of agreement rippling through the amphitheater. The human who entered moved with that particularly human combination of purposeful hurry and apologetic body language, the kind that said, "I'm late, I know I'm late, I'm sorry I'm late, please don't look at me," while simultaneously drawing everyone's attention. They wore what humans apparently considered diplomatic formal wear, which involved more layers than strictly necessary and a color palette that humans found professional and most species found bewildering. In one hand, they carried a sealed container that released small wisps of steam and smelled like burned plant matter, which the human database helpfully identified as coffee, stimulant beverage, culturally significant, probably shouldn't ask why they're so dependent on it. The human found a seat in the back section, tried to sit quietly, and immediately knocked over the hydration apparatus belonging to a Melthari scholar, who made a sound like wind through a broken pipe organ. Several dozen heads, optical sensors, and sensory organs turned. The human mouthed something that was probably an apology, retrieved the apparatus with excessive care, and attempted to achieve invisibility through sheer force of will. It didn't work. Humans was still enough of a novelty in these circles that one couldn't simply fade into the background. Thex'ron interrupted mid-conclusion, paused. 3 of his manipulator limbs twitched in irritation, while the others maintained the holographic display. As I was concluding, he resumed with forced patience. The Qor'vathian language represents a threshold case for linguistic possibility. It teaches us about the limits of biological phonetics and the importance of, sorry, quick question. The voice came from the back. Human vocal cords, the translator confirmed unnecessarily, as if anyone could have missed it. The amphitheater achieved a silence that went beyond mere quiet into the realm of collective held breath. Several hundred beings experienced the same thought simultaneously. Who interrupts a keynote presentation? The designated question period, Thex'ron said with the careful enunciation of someone counting to 10 internally, follows the presentation's conclusion. Right, yeah, totally my bad, the human said, not sounding particularly apologetic. Just, you mentioned it's biologically impossible to speak. Like, for any species. That is the research consensus spanning 412 cycles of dedicated study, yes. Huh. The human took a sip from the plant-burning container. That's weird. The amphitheater waited. The human didn't elaborate, just sat there drinking burned plant water and looking vaguely confused. Doctor, Milivos pulsed a curious green. Was there a specific inquiry you wish to make? Oh yeah, sorry. Shuttle got delayed, missed the morning sessions. Just seems like the stuff you're describing isn't that different from languages we have on Earth. If the previous silence had been profound, this one achieved transcendence. 317 scholars, scientists, and military observers directed their complete attention toward the human in the back row, who seemed oblivious to having just committed what amounted to academic heresy. Captain Raxthor turned fully around in his seat, which involved his entire armored torso, rotating with mechanical precision. His predatory eyes focused on the human, with an intensity that made several nearby delegates shift nervously. "Explain that statement." The human seemed to realize they'd stepped into something. "Well, like the tonal thing? We have languages with 7, 8, even 9 distinct tones. Mandarin Chinese has 4 basic tones plus a neutral one. Cantonese has 6 or 9 depending on who you ask. Some African languages have even more complex tonal systems, where the same consonant-vowel combination means completely different things based on pitch." Thex'ron's exoskeleton had gone very still, which in Nyx body language indicated either deep thought or imminent violence. And the simultaneous articulation requirements. "Oh, the click thing? Yeah, we've got that. Xhosa, Zulu, couple other languages from Southern Africa. They have multiple click consonants produced at different positions in the mouth. Some of them are really complicated, with the tongue making contact in 3 or 4 places while also controlling airflow and adding voice or not adding voice. There's this one language, I think it's called Ta or Zoo, that's said with a click at the beginning, by the way has something like 160 distinct phonemes. It's wild." The amphitheater had progressed beyond silence into some kind of acoustic event horizon, where sound seemed reluctant to exist. "And the breath control requirements?" Dr. Millivos asked, their field flickering with colors that suggested their equivalent of a system error. "I mean, have you heard Tuvan throat singing? Or Mongolian overtone singing? Those require really specific breathing patterns and producing multiple pitches simultaneously. And circular breathing is a whole thing for wind instruments, where you breathe in through your nose while pushing air out with your cheeks, maintaining continuous sound. Didgeridoo players do it for minutes at a time. It's a learned skill, but not like superhuman or anything." Professor Thex'ron made a sound that the translator struggled with before settling on exasperated disbelief. "You are claiming that Earth possesses languages with comparable complexity to Qor'vathian." "I mean, I haven't studied Qor'vathian specifically," the human admitted. "That's not my department. I'm just here for the cultural exchange program, sitting in on sessions. But based on what you're describing, doesn't sound wildly different from combining features we already have. Like if you took Mandarin's tones, added some Xhosa clicks, threw in some throat singing techniques, combined it with the kind of rapid articulation you need for auctioneer-style speech or beatboxing." The human paused. "Is that not normal?" "No," approximately 50 scholars said in perfect synchronization, which would have been impressive if it weren't so horrifying. The human blinked, which was a very human gesture that involved temporarily closing one's optical organs for no apparent reason. "Oh." Captain Rax Thor leaned forward, his armored plates shifting with a sound like knives being sharpened. "Humans can produce these sounds?" "Well, yeah. I mean, not every human speaks every language, obviously. But we've got the anatomy for it. Vocal cords, tongue mobility, breath control. It's kind of what we do." "What you do," Thex'ron repeated slowly. "Yeah. Language, speech. We're pretty good at it. We teach kids this stuff in kindergarten. You know, early childhood education. Like 5-year-olds learning tonal languages or click consonants as their first language, because that's what their parents speak. If someone had announced that entropy was reversing and time was flowing backwards, it would have caused less disruption than this statement." Scholars erupted in 62 languages simultaneously, which sent the translation systems into cascading failure, creating a cacophony that sounded like the universe's most aggressive multilingual debate club having a collective breakdown. Silence. Thex'ron's voice, amplified by his species' natural resonance and probably some illegal volume augmentation, cut through the chaos. The amphitheater settled into something resembling order, though several beings continued making agitated noises that their translators marked as ongoing distress. "You are claiming," Thex'ron continued with the careful precision of someone whose worldview was crumbling, "that human children juveniles, not yet fully developed, are taught phonetic capabilities that we have classified as biologically impossible." "I mean," the human looked genuinely confused. Yeah? It's not special, just normal language development. Kids are actually better at it than adults. That's why we have critical period acquisition windows, and why people who learn languages young don't have accents, neuroplasticity, and all that. You guys don't have this? No, the assembled scholars confirmed, this time with feeling. Dr. Milivos had shifted to a color that didn't exist in standard electromagnetic spectrum descriptions, but strongly suggested existential crisis. A demonstration would be informative. You could not possibly produce the sounds we have described. The ones in the hologram? I mean, I could try. I'm not a Qor'vathian speaker or anything. But if you've got a phonetic breakdown. 4 scholars immediately rushed forward, brandishing datapads like weapons or possibly religious artifacts. They nearly collided in their eagerness, which would have been amusing if the entire scientific community present weren't having a collective ontological crisis. The human accepted a datapad, squinted at the screen, and scrolled through what appeared to be extensive phonetic notation. Okay, so this is right. This first one is like a high-falling tone on a lateral click, transitioning to a mid-level tone with a uvular trill, then ending with a glottal stop plus some kind of subharmonic resonance. The human looked up. That's actually pretty interesting. Combines like 4 different linguistic features. Can I try it, or is this just theoretical? Please. Captain Raxthor said, and his translator captured perfectly the predatory anticipation in his voice. The human cleared their throat, which several species found alarming because it sounded like a biological malfunction. Okay, gonna butcher this probably. Fair warning. What emerged from the human's mouth should have been impossible. The sound began as a click that any Xhosa speaker would recognize, sharp and precise against the side of the mouth. It transitioned through a tonal glide that demonstrated the kind of pitch control that Mandarin required, flowing from high to mid-level like water finding its level. The uvular trill came next, that back-of-throat rolling sound that existed in French and Arabic, vibrating with mechanical precision. And it ended with a glottal stop, that little catch in the back of the throat, while somehow maintaining a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the human's chest cavity. It wasn't perfect. The human was clearly sight-reading, approximating, making educated guesses based on notation they'd just seen. But it was recognizable, structurally sound, the kind of thing that would pass muster in a basic linguistics course as decent attempt, needs practice, B+. It was also supposed to be biologically impossible. The amphitheater had achieved a state beyond silence, beyond quiet, beyond the mere absence of sound. This was the acoustic equivalent of a vacuum, where noise had looked around, decided things were getting too weird, and evacuated the premises entirely. Huh, the human said into that absolute void. That felt weird. Did I get close? Nobody answered. 317 beings were experiencing the scientific equivalent of a system crash, that moment when everything you've built your understanding on suddenly reveals itself to be standing on nothing. A Felthari scholar in the 4th row made a sound like atmospheric pressure equalizing rapidly, which was their species' expression of profound confusion bordering on panic. The simultaneous phonation. The human continued, apparently interpreting silence as interest. That's the tricky part. But it's basically just combining techniques, right? Like beatboxers do weird stuff with breath control and multiple sounds at once, and throat singers produce that drone note while also doing the overtones. Once you figure out the coordination, it's not that bad. Professor Thex'ron had gone completely dark, his usually iridescent exoskeleton absorbing light rather than reflecting it, which in Nixtarii body language indicated something between deep shock and the mental equivalent of rebooting. His manipulator limbs had frozen mid-gesture, giving him the appearance of a very confused starfish having an existential moment. Dr. Milivos spoke first. Their energy field, pulsing with colors that had no names but conveyed reality, is more flexible than previously assumed, and I'm not sure how to feel about that. That was. But we modeled every species in our databases. Did you model humans? The human asked reasonably. The pause that followed answered the question more effectively than words. Human anatomy. Captain Raxthor said slowly, his military training allowing him to process the tactical implications faster than the academics could handle the theoretical ones, was not included in comparative phonetic databases because your species achieved interstellar capability 39 standard cycles ago. You were classified as emergent civilization, not relevant to studies of 10,000-cycle-old extinct languages. Ah. The human nodded. Yeah, that would do it. We are pretty new at the whole space thing. Your vocal anatomy. Thex'ron managed, his translator adding an appropriate tremor to his voice. Describe it. In detail. The human shrugged, another gesture that involved moving body parts for no apparent communicative reason, except humans did it constantly. I'm not a biologist, but basics are. We have descended larynxes compared to other primates. Sits lower in the throat, gives us a big pharyngeal cavity for resonance. Our vocal cords' vocal folds technically can produce a huge range of frequencies. Like, we can go from really low bass sounds to high-pitched stuff that some species probably can't even hear. Our tongues are super flexible. Way more precise control than we actually need for normal speech. Independent velum control for nasal versus oral sounds. And our breathing capacity is kind of ridiculous. Ridiculous how? Captain Raxthor demanded. Humans are persistence hunters, or were, evolutionarily. We'd chase prey for hours until it collapsed from exhaustion. We can't sprint worth anything compared to real predators, but we just keep going. And apparently that's selected for really efficient breathing and the ability to communicate while exercising. So we ended up with vocal systems that are kind of overbuilt for normal conversation. The human said this like it was normal. The assembled scholars heard, we are endurance predators, with vocal systems designed for marathon communication and experienced various forms of species-specific alarm. So when you combine the descended larynx, the human continued, oblivious to the growing horror, with the oversized resonance chambers and the precise articulation control and the breath capacity that lets us talk while running for miles, humans can make a really wide range of sounds. Most of our languages only use a fraction of what we're actually capable of producing. You're telling me, Professor Thex'ron said with the careful precision of someone whose life's work was disintegrating in real time, that humans are accidentally optimized for speaking Qor'vathian. I wouldn't say optimized. We didn't evolve to speak some random alien language. But yeah, seems like we've got the anatomy for it. You'd want someone actually trained in Qor'vathian to do it properly, not just some diplomatic attaché who minored in linguistics. We've got professional voice actors who can mimic any accent or sound, polyglots who speak 15, 20 languages, opera singers who can hit notes most species probably think are theoretical. If you actually wanted someone to tackle this language seriously, Earth's got people way better qualified than me. The implications of this statement hit the room like a kinetic weapon. Captain Raxthor spoke first because military minds were trained to think tactically. The archives. Still sealed. Thex'ron confirmed automatically, then stopped. Sealed with vocal authentication protocols that require Qor'vathian pronunciation. Pronunciation we couldn't provide. Dr. Milivos added, their energy field cycling through rapid color changes that suggested their consciousness was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously. But humans could, a scholar in the back breathed, their translator adding appropriate reverence to the realization. The human, who had resumed drinking the burned plant liquid, nearly choked. Wait, what archives? The Qor'vath. Captain Raxthor explained with military efficiency, left behind extensive data repositories in every facility we've discovered. Technology specifications, scientific databases, cultural records, medical advances. Every archive is protected by voice lock security systems that require spoken Qor'vathian passwords. We have the words. We have pronunciation guides in their instructional materials. We simply couldn't produce the sounds accurately enough to unlock them. Oh, the human processed this. Oh, so this is like, actually important. Not just academic. The Qor'vath were the most technologically advanced civilization in recorded history, Thex'ron said, his earlier pomposity replaced by intensity. Their engineering principles enabled practical interstellar travel. Their medical knowledge has saved trillions of lives. Their energy systems power half the installations in this sector. And we've translated maybe 4% of their written materials. Everything else is locked behind systems we couldn't access. Because you couldn't pronounce the password language, the human repeated. Correct. But I might be able to. You just did, Dr. Milivos pointed out, their field vibrating with barely contained excitement. Imperfectly, yes. With training, with proper instruction and practice, a human could potentially unlock Qor'vathian archives that have been sealed for 10,000 cycles. The human sat back heavily in their seat. That's, wow. Okay. That's a lot of pressure to put on one mediocre attempt at phonetic reproduction. Not just you, Captain Raxthor said, and his predatory smile translated perfectly across species barriers. Your entire species. This observation triggered a new wave of chaos as scholars immediately began calculating implications, contacting their institutions, and engaging in the kind of academic networking that looked suspiciously like political maneuvering. The careful symposium atmosphere dissolved into something resembling a commodities exchange during a market crash, if the commodities were linguistic theories and the crash was human vocal anatomy. The human wisely stayed quiet and focused on the coffee. It took Professor Thex'ron approximately 12 minutes to restore something resembling order, mostly by threatening to revoke symposium credentials and ban people from future conferences. The assembled scholars settled into attentive chaos, which was the best that could be expected under the circumstances. We must approach this systematically, Thex'ron announced, his scientific training reasserting itself over his existential crisis. First priority, verification. One human producing approximations is insufficient data for peer review. I can contact Earth's Linguistic Council, the human offered. They're going to lose their minds about this. In a good way. Probably, you might get 50 volunteers by tomorrow. Maybe more if word spreads on the academic networks. Second priority, establishing access protocols for Qor'vathian archives. This cannot become a disorganized scramble. Too late, Captain Raxthor muttered, gesturing at the room where approximately 40 scholars were already having intense conversations on communication devices. Third priority, understanding why human vocal anatomy succeeds where others fail. We need comprehensive comparative studies. And fourth, Dr. Milivos added, their field pulsing with colors that suggested they were thinking several steps ahead. We must consider the socio-political implications. Qor'vathian ruins span multiple territorial jurisdictions. Access to their technology has always been collaboratively managed by necessity. This changes the dynamic considerably, which was putting it mildly. The human watched various scholars' expressions or species equivalent thereof shift as they calculated what it meant that one species could suddenly access resources that had been collectively unavailable. The politics were going to be complicated, which was probably why the human was here in a diplomatic capacity rather than just a linguistic one. My government, Captain Raxthor said, checking his communication device, is dispatching a xenobiology team to Earth immediately. They want full anatomical studies and vocal capability assessments. This has been classified as priority-level security concern. Security, the human asked. You can speak a language that unlocks facilities containing potential weapons technology. Raxthor said bluntly. What did you expect? I was hoping for, like a nice collaborative research project and maybe getting my name on a paper. The human admitted. You'll get those. After the security clearances and diplomatic negotiations and treaty revisions. The human looked like they were regretting their career choices. Over the following hours, the symposium transformed from an academic conference into something between a diplomatic summit and a crisis response meeting. Representatives from multiple governments arrived, requiring expanded seating and additional atmospheric controls. The human found themselves at the center of approximately 15 conversations simultaneously, none of which they were qualified for but all of which they were stuck participating in because they were the only human present. Earth's diplomatic corps was apparently having a coordinated panic attack based on the increasingly urgent messages appearing on the human's datapad. The human kept trying to explain that they weren't actually a Qor'vathian expert, just someone who happened to have human vocal cords and some basic linguistic training, but nobody seemed interested in this distinction. Professor Thex'ron had retreated to a corner with several colleagues, furiously recalculating models and muttering about sample bias and dataset limitations. Dr. Milivos was already drafting a paper with the working title Phonetic Possibility Reconsidered. Why we were wrong about everything, which was more honest than most academic writing, but probably wouldn't make it past peer review in that form. Captain Rax Thor was engaged in what appeared to be a very intense holographic conversation with someone who kept making aggressive gestures. Military contingency planning, presumably. The kind that involved phrases like strategic asset and controlled access and other terms that made the human nervous. "This is insane," the human said to a nearby Melthari scholar who looked equally overwhelmed. "Welcome to Xenolinguistics," the scholar replied, "where minor phonetic observations trigger interstellar policy crises." Does this happen often? First time, actually. Usually we just argue about vowel classifications. Eventually, after what felt like several lifetimes, but was probably only 4 hours, a preliminary framework emerged. The Galactic Linguistic Council would partner with Earth's academic institutions to train human specialists in Qor'vathian. A joint task force would be established to systematically access Qor'vathian archives, with appropriate security protocols and information sharing agreements. Extensive research would be conducted into human vocal anatomy to understand why humans succeeded where hundreds of other species failed. The human would be required to remain on Nexus Prime for the next 8 days to undergo testing, training, and approximately 20 different diplomatic meetings. They accepted this, with the resignation of someone whose nice cultural exchange program had just become an international incident spanning multiple star systems. "Consider the historical significance," Professor Thex'ron said, attempting consolation. "You're facilitating access to 10,000-year-old knowledge." "I just made some sounds," the human protested. "That's not historical, that's just phonetics. You made sounds that will unlock technology we've been unable to reach for centuries." "I haven't unlocked anything yet. I just did an approximation." "Details," Captain Rax Thor said dismissively. The symposium officially concluded at 2147 station time. Approximately 8 hours after it had begun and 7 hours after it had completely abandoned the original agenda, scholars departed in various states of excitement, confusion, and ontological crisis, which was typical for major conferences, but usually took the full 3-day program to achieve. The human remained in the amphitheater, surrounded by datapads, phonetic charts, and the lingering smell of coffee that several species found deeply unsettling. Professor Thex'ron approached, moving with the body language of someone trying to salvage dignity from disaster. "I may have been," he said carefully, premature in declaring Qor'vathian impossible to speak. "It's cool," the human said, too tired for diplomacy. "Science is about updating conclusions when you get new data. That's literally how it works." "Indeed." Thex'ron's manipulator limbs arranged themselves in what might have been sheepish positioning. "I have dedicated 163 cycles to studying this language. Published extensively on its impossibility. Built an entire research program around that conclusion. That's really impressive dedication. And you casually produced the sounds in less than a quarter hour." The human winced. "Yeah, sorry about that. Don't apologize." Thex'ron's tone was difficult to read through the translator, but might have been wry acceptance. "This is perhaps the most significant development in xenolinguistics since we established the field. I'm simply processing the reality that my life's work was based on incomplete data." "You weren't wrong based on the species you studied," the human offered. "You just didn't have humans in your dataset. That's not bad science, that's insufficient sample size. Happens all the time." Generous interpretation. Thex'ron gestured at the phonetic charts. "I would like to collaborate with your species on this. If you're willing to work with someone who spent a century being confidently incorrect." "Being wrong is how science progresses," the human said. "And yeah, Collaboration sounds great. I'm going to need a lot of help. I can make the sounds, but I have no idea what they mean. Then perhaps, Thex'ron said, we can learn from each other. Which was, the human reflected later, probably the best possible outcome for accidentally causing an academic crisis. 6 months later, the Galactic News Network ran a feature story about the first successfully unlocked Qor'vathian archive. The vocal authentication had been provided by a human linguist who'd undergone 4 months of intensive training, which was apparently sufficient time for humans to become functionally fluent in a language that had been considered biologically impossible to speak. The archive had contained medical technology that would revolutionize treatment for approximately 60 different diseases, which sparked celebrations across multiple star systems. It had also contained what appeared to be Qor'vathian joke collections, which scholars immediately began arguing about because apparently humor was controversial even across 10,000 years of temporal distance. Earth's universities were now offering Qor'vathian language courses as part of their xenolinguistics programs. Enrollment was surprisingly high. Apparently being able to speak an impossible language looked good on resumes and grad school applications. Human children in specialized language immersion programs were learning Idritri 2C continue edit alongside Mandarin and Spanish, which meant the galaxy's greatest linguistic puzzle was now being taught to 7-year-olds between mathematics lessons and lunch breaks. Professor Thex'ron had co-authored a groundbreaking paper with human researchers titled Reassessing Phonetic Impossibility, a case study in dataset bias and anatomical variation. It had won the Korvax Prize for Linguistic Innovation and fundamentally restructured how xenolinguistics approached the concept of biological limits in language production. The paper's acknowledgments section included a somewhat embarrassed admission that 4 centuries of research had failed to consider that vocal anatomy might vary more widely than their models suggested, which was academic speak for we should have checked more species before declaring things impossible. Thex'ron had also begun learning Mandarin Chinese, partly for research purposes and partly because he wanted to understand the tonal thing firsthand. He hated it passionately. The 4 tones seemed specifically designed to humiliate him, and his translator kept rendering his attempts as completely different words than intended, leading to several awkward conversations where he'd accidentally asked for bathroom directions when trying to discuss phonetic theory. But he was making progress, which he considered a minor miracle and his human tutors considered adequate for a beginner who keeps using 3 limbs to gesture while trying to concentrate on tones. Dr. Milivos had relocated to Earth temporarily, establishing a research partnership with the University of Mumbai's Linguistics Department. Studying human vocal anatomy in person had proven fascinating, though it had required several confused medical professionals to figure out how to accommodate an energy-based entity in their facilities. The research was progressing excellently. Milivos had published preliminary findings on the relationship between human evolutionary pressures and phonetic flexibility, with particular emphasis on how persistence hunting had inadvertently created a species capable of extreme vocal precision. The paper included detailed anatomical scans, spectrographic analyses, and one memorable footnote about how humans could apparently learn to produce sounds they'd never heard before with only minimal instruction, which Milivos found both impressive and slightly terrifying. Captain Raxthor's government had indeed established security protocols around Qor'vathian archive access, but they'd been surprisingly reasonable about it. Mostly because every major governmental entity wanted access to the archives, and being obstructionist would have been strategically counterproductive. The Joint Task Force was operating smoothly, having unlocked 17 archives across 9 star systems in the past 6 months. Each unlock required a human translator, proper authorization from the relevant territorial authorities, and enough security personnel to make everyone feel important. It was bureaucratic and occasionally tedious, but it was working. The technology recovered so far included advances in medical imaging, energy storage systems that operated at 94% efficiency, material science breakthroughs that would take decades to fully implement, and what appeared to be the Qor'vathian equivalent of a cooking show, which had become inexplicably popular across multiple species despite nobody being entirely certain what the Qor'vath had actually been cooking, or whether it was even edible by contemporary standards. The human linguistic attaché, who'd started everything, had completed their diplomatic rotation and returned to Earth, where they'd been immediately recruited by 7 different universities, 4 government agencies, and 2 private linguistics firms that specialized in alien language consulting. They'd chosen to pursue a doctorate instead, figuring they should probably actually study Qor'vathian formally if they were going to be historically significant for speaking it. Their dissertation proposal, Comparative Phonetic Analysis of Qor'vathian and Earth Languages, Why We're Accidentally Good at This, had been approved with enthusiasm and a generous research grant. They were currently teaching Introduction to Xenolinguistics to undergraduates while working on their research, which was ironic but not unpleasant. The undergrads were fascinated by the Qor'vathian situation, though mostly because it made humans seem special in a universe where being special was difficult. The human kept trying to explain that it was just anatomy, just evolutionary accident, nothing particularly impressive about being able to make sounds. The students didn't care. They wanted to learn the impossible language that only humans could speak, which was admittedly pretty cool from a certain perspective. On Nexus Prime, the Temporal Linguistics Institute had undergone significant restructuring. Their comparative anatomy database now included detailed profiles of over 200 species, with particular emphasis on vocal apparatus diversity. They'd hired 3 human consultants to advise on phonetic possibility assessments, which had the amusing effect of making the humans the people you asked when you wanted to know if a sound was theoretically producible. The Institute had also established a new research division focused on previously overlooked linguistic capabilities, which was a polite way of saying things we declared impossible but maybe should double-check. The next triennial symposium was already being planned, with the theme expanding the boundaries of phonetic theory. Early registration numbers suggested it would be the most attended conference in the Institute's history, which made sense given that the field had just experienced its biggest paradigm shift in centuries. Several sessions were specifically dedicated to human vocal anatomy, which felt weird to the human researchers invited to present, but was apparently fascinating to everyone else. In a kindergarten classroom in Lagos, Nigeria, a 5-year-old successfully pronounced a Qor'vathian phrase that had stumped the galaxy's best linguists for 400 years. She did this while also coloring outside the lines of her drawing, which her teacher gently corrected while privately thinking that the child had just accomplished something multiple alien species considered physiologically impossible. The child had no idea. She just knew she was learning 2 new languages this year, Qor'vathian and French, and the Qor'vathian one had cool clicking sounds that were fun to make. Her classmate, who spoke Yoruba as his first language and was learning Qor'vathian as his third, informed her that she was doing the tonal part wrong. She informed him that he was doing the clicks wrong. They argued about it with the intensity that only 5-year-olds could bring to linguistic debates, which sounded like incomprehensible babbling to most observers, but would have made Professor Thex'ron weep with professional jealousy because both children were technically correct about different phonetic features. Their teacher separated them and redirected them to their art project, making a mental note to submit her classroom's language learning outcomes to the education journal that had been requesting data on early Qor'vathian acquisition. Apparently, teaching an impossible language to small children was considered publishable research now. Who knew? Somewhere in the Qor'vathian ruins on Threshold Station, a door that had been sealed for 10,000 years opened in response to a human voice, speaking the proper authentication phrase. Inside was a repository containing gravitational manipulation technology that would, over the next decade, completely revolutionize space travel and make interstellar transport approximately 40 times more efficient. This discovery would eventually lead to an economic boom, save approximately 4 million hours of collective travel time annually, and enable the establishment of colonies in previously inaccessible regions. The human who unlocked it said, "Oh wow, this is so cool," before remembering they were being recorded for historical documentation, and switching to "this represents an unprecedented archaeological moment of significant scientific importance," which fooled absolutely nobody but satisfied the archival requirements. The galaxy was adapting to its new reality. The species that had spent centuries agreeing that Qor'vathian was impossible to speak were now partnering with the species that taught it to kindergartners. Research programs flourished, diplomatic channels expanded, cultural exchange programs multiplied as aliens tried to understand how humans could do this thing that shouldn't be possible. And humans tried to explain that it really wasn't that impressive, they just had flexible throats and good breath control. The Velnari started a formal study of human evolutionary history, trying to understand what environmental pressures had created such phonetic flexibility. The Qor'vathian military academies added human vocal anatomy to their xenobiology curriculum, filed under potential strategic advantages of allied species. The Nexus academic institutions established exchange programs with Earth universities, sending their brightest students to study human language acquisition patterns firsthand. Humans, meanwhile, were discovering that being the only species that could speak an ancient language came with unexpected social capital. Human linguists were in high demand. Human voice actors found themselves with lucrative consulting contracts, teaching aliens how to produce sounds that were technically still impossible for those aliens to make, but humans could approximate well enough for entertainment purposes. Human children's educational programming started including Qor'vathian segments, usually featuring animated characters, exploring ancient ruins and teaching pronunciation between lessons about friendship and basic mathematics. The galaxy's perspective on humans shifted slightly. They'd already been considered unusual persistent hunters, pack bonding with inappropriate species, industrial revolution speedrunners, questionable risk assessment. Now they were also the species that can speak the impossible language, which fit the general pattern of humans being accidentally good at things they had no evolutionary reason to be good at. Professor Thex'ron, updating his comprehensive textbook on Qor'vathian linguistics for the 9th time in 6 months, paused to contemplate the trajectory of his career. He'd spent over a century building an academic reputation on studying an impossible language. He'd published extensively, mentored countless students, established theoretical frameworks that had guided research across multiple institutions. And then a human had shown up with coffee and casually demolished 400 years of consensus in approximately 15 minutes. He decided he was okay with this, actually. Science was supposed to evolve. Theories were meant to be challenged. Understanding was supposed to deepen with new evidence. And if that new evidence came in the form of a slightly confused human who'd minored in linguistics and happened to have evolved from persistence hunters with oversized pharyngeal cavities, well, that was just how discovery worked sometimes. Besides, the humans had shared their coffee, which was legitimately helpful for dealing with paradigm shifts. He still wasn't sure why they burned the beans before brewing them, but the resulting beverage did seem to facilitate focus during intensive research sessions. He tried to analyze its chemical composition to understand the cognitive effects, but the human researchers just laughed and said, "Yeah, we don't really understand it either. We just know it works." Which was surprisingly human, when he thought about it, just doing things that worked without fully understanding why. Making sounds they technically shouldn't be able to make because nobody had told their evolution it was impossible. Teaching impossible languages to children because the children didn't know they were supposed to find it difficult. Dr. Milivos, conducting their latest interview with a human opera singer who could hit frequencies that most species needed instruments to produce, came to a similar realization. Humans didn't approach phonetics the way other species did. They didn't calculate possibility first. They just tried things, made adjustments, practiced until it worked. Their language acquisition research emphasized immersion and exposure over theoretical modeling. Children learned by listening and imitating, not by studying the biomechanical requirements first. It was chaotic and inefficient, and somehow extraordinarily effective. The opera singer was currently demonstrating a technique called whistle register that produced notes around 2000 Hz with minimal effort. Milivos's instruments confirmed that yes, those were the frequencies being generated, and yes, the human was doing this with organic vocal cords that had no business producing such sounds with such clarity, and yes, This was apparently something humans could just learn to do if they practiced enough. Your species, Milivos said through their translator, continues to baffle me. That's fair, the opera singer replied cheerfully. We baffle ourselves pretty regularly too. Captain Raxthor, reviewing security footage from the latest archive unlock, watched a human translator casually produce a 43-second Qor'vathian phrase. With continuous airflow, complex tonal shifts, multiple click consonants, and subharmonic resonance that his instruments registered, but his ears couldn't fully process. The human did this while standing in a partial atmosphere that was technically breathable but not comfortable, surrounded by ruins that predated most contemporary civilizations, speaking words that meant access granted for authorized personnel, with proper clearance codes and acknowledgement of safety protocols. The door had opened. The archive had yielded technology that would improve shield systems by 18%. And the human had immediately asked if there was somewhere to get coffee nearby because the translation work had taken 40 minutes and they needed caffeine. Raxthor had spent his entire military career studying tactical advantages, strategic capabilities, and threat assessments. Humans, he'd concluded, were accidentally militarily relevant in the strangest possible ways. They couldn't outfight most species. They couldn't outrun most predators. Their technology had been primitive until recently. But they could speak a language that unlocked ancient weapon systems, which was possibly the weirdest tactical advantage he'd ever encountered in 40 years of service. He approved the coffee requisition and made a note to recommend increased human integration in xenoarchaeological military operations. Back on Earth, in a small apartment in Mexico City, the former diplomatic attaché was grading undergraduate papers on basic phonetic transcription while simultaneously practicing Qor'vathian pronunciation for their dissertation research. The papers were about what you'd expect from first-year students, some excellent, some confused. One that had clearly been written an hour before the deadline and contained the phrase "sounds are hard" as a thesis statement. The Qor'vathian practice was going better. They'd progressed from basic phrases to complex technical passages, could sight-read most standard texts with reasonable accuracy, and had achieved what their advisor called functional fluency in a language that had been considered unlearnable 6 months ago. It still felt weird. They'd just made some sounds, that was all. Sounds that humans made all the time in various combinations across thousands of Earth languages. But those sounds had unlocked 10,000-year-old doors, revealed technology that would change the galaxy, and apparently made them historically significant. Their phone chimed with a message from Professor Thex'ron, who was still struggling with Mandarin tones but wanted to know if they had time to review his latest paper on phonetic possibility theory. They replied affirmatively, sent some encouragement about his Mandarin progress, and returned to grading papers. Outside their window, Mexico City continued its evening routine, millions of humans going about their lives, speaking dozens of languages, making thousands of different sounds with their oversized pharyngeal cavities and flexible larynxes and precise tongue control. None of them knew they were physiologically exceptional. They just talked, laughed, sang, argued, taught their children words and sounds and languages. And somewhere in the galaxy, those same capabilities were revolutionizing archaeology, unlocking ancient secrets, and forcing entire academic fields to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about biological possibility. The universe, as always, had a sense of humor. Humans were just better at accidentally being its punchline. In a military academy on Krath Prime, cadets were learning about the Qor'vathian incident as it had been officially designated. The case study emphasized the importance of comprehensive data collection before reaching conclusions, the strategic value of allied species with unexpected capabilities, and the necessity of remaining flexible in tactical assessments. The instructor, a veteran of 40 campaigns, told them that the greatest lesson was simple: never assume impossibility just because you haven't seen something done. One of the cadets raised a talon. "But sir, the humans really can just make any sound." "Not any sound," the instructor corrected. "They have biological limits like any species. But their limits are significantly broader than we'd modeled. They evolved under specific pressures that created unusual capabilities. That's not special. That's evolution. But they're the only ones who can speak Qor'vathian. They're the only ones we've found so far, the instructor said. The galaxy is vast. Perhaps there are others. Perhaps the Qor'vath themselves had similar anatomy. We don't know. What we do know is that assuming impossibility limited our thinking for 400 years. Don't make that mistake. The cadets absorbed this, filed it away with their other tactical lessons, and moved on to the next subject. But several of them made notes to study human evolutionary history, just to understand how persistence hunting created the galaxy's most phonetically flexible species. On Nexus Prime, in the archives of the Temporal Linguistics Institute, a junior researcher was cataloging the historical records of the Qor'vathian symposium that had changed everything. The recordings, the papers, the frantic communications from scholars who'd watched their life's work transform in real time. It was fascinating from a historical perspective, watching the exact moment when scientific consensus shattered. The researcher paused at the recording of the human's first demonstration, that moment when an impossible sound emerged from a human throat, when centuries of certainty crumbled, when the galaxy's understanding of phonetic possibility expanded in the space of a single syllable. The researcher, who was Threnzy like Professor Thex'ron, made a note in their catalog, the Qor'vathian incident, a case study in the dangers of premature certainty and the value of intellectual humility. Then they added a personal note, not for the official records but for themselves, also a reminder that the galaxy is weirder than we think, and humans are usually somehow involved in that weirdness. It wasn't professional academic language, but it was accurate. The galaxy turned, civilizations rose and fell. Languages evolved and changed and sometimes got resurrected by species who'd evolved to chase antelopes while gossiping. The Qor'vath had left their mark on history 10,000 years ago, building technology that still impressed, leaving archives that still yielded secrets, creating a language that had baffled scholars for centuries. And humans, who'd only been in space for 40 years and were still figuring out how to be an interstellar civilization without accidentally starting diplomatic incidents, had become the key to unlocking that legacy, all because their ancestors had needed to talk while running marathons and had developed unnecessarily complex vocal capabilities in the process. Professor Thex'ron, finally managing to correctly pronounce a Mandarin sentence without accidentally asking for the bathroom, smiled to himself. Or performed his species equivalent of smiling, which involved a subtle shift in his exoskeleton's light refraction that indicated satisfaction. He'd spent 163 cycles studying the impossible, and it turned out the impossible was just difficult if you had the right anatomy. Which humans, through sheer evolutionary coincidence, did. Science, he reflected, was about being wrong until you got it right. And sometimes it took a species of persistent hunters with coffee dependency and flexible throats to show you where you'd gone wrong. He could live with that, the galaxy could live with that, and the humans? They were already teaching the impossible language to their children, incorporating it into their linguistic education programs, treating it like just another thing to learn between mathematics and recess. Because that's what humans did. They took the impossible, made it mundane, and moved on to the next challenge. The universe watched this with what might have been amusement, if the universe had opinions about such things. And somewhere, in the vast archives of Qor'vathian ruins scattered across 47 star systems, thousands of sealed doors waited. Inside them, technology, knowledge, secrets that would take generations to fully understand and implement. All locked behind vocal authentication systems that required one thing: a human voice, speaking the impossible language that they taught in kindergarten. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Never assume impossibility. Never underestimate humans. And never, ever declare something biologically unachievable until you've checked whether humans can do it, because odds were decent, they'd been doing it casually for thousands of years and just hadn't mentioned it. The Qor'vathian incident, as it was now officially known, had changed xenolinguistics forever. It had altered diplomatic relationships, military strategies, and academic methodologies. It had proven that 400 years of research could be overturned by 15 minutes of demonstration. It had shown that the galaxy's understanding of biological possibility was narrower than reality. And it had all started because a human showed up late to a conference, drank some coffee, listened to a presentation, and said, "Wait, you mean you can't do that? We teach that to 5-year-olds." Sometimes, the most profound scientific revolutions came not from brilliant theoretical insights or technological breakthroughs, but from someone asking, "Have you tried checking if humans can do it?" The answer, increasingly, was, "No, but we probably should have." The galaxy learned. The galaxy adapted. The galaxy continued its eternal spin through space. Now with slightly better understanding of phonetic possibility and significantly more appreciation for the weird anatomical capabilities of persistence hunters who'd evolved to talk while running. And the humans? They just kept making sounds, teaching languages, unlocking ancient archives, and generally being accidentally exceptional at things they had no business being good at. Which was, when you thought about it, the most human thing imaginable. The end of this story was really just the beginning of a new chapter in galactic linguistics, human integration into interstellar society, and the ongoing project of understanding what was possible versus what was merely assumed to be impossible. But that was fine. Science was always ongoing. Discovery never really ended. And there were still thousands of Qor'vathian archives waiting to be unlocked. Good thing humans existed. And good thing they'd evolved such ridiculous vocal capabilities while chasing prey across ancient African plains. Never knowing that 10,000 years in the future, those same capabilities would unlock the secrets of a civilization that had vanished before humans had even invented agriculture. Evolution was funny that way. You never knew which random adaptations would turn out to be universe-changingly important. Professor Thex'ron returned to his Mandarin studies, determined to master at least one human language, since humans had mastered the language he'd spent a century studying. Dr. Milivos continued their anatomical research, fascinated by every new discovery about human vocal capabilities. Captain Raxthor filed his reports, updated his strategic assessments, and made sure the human translators in his operations always had access to coffee. And the human who'd started everything finished grading their students' papers, practiced their Qor'vathian pronunciation, and contemplated the weirdness of accidentally becoming historically significant for having a descended larynx and oversized pharyngeal cavity. The galaxy continued its eternal rotation, now with better coffee, more unlocked archives, and a deeper appreciation for checking your assumptions before declaring things impossible. Somewhere, the universe smiled. If universes could smile, which they probably couldn't. But if they could, this would be the moment. Because really, the story of humans casually solving the galaxy's greatest linguistic mystery by virtue of being accidentally over-engineered for speech was exactly the kind of cosmic joke that made existence interesting. And the punchline was still being written, one unlocked archive at a time.